For most of her life, Mariya Oktyabrskaya lived in a world that felt ordinary, a world built on routine, quiet mornings, and small hopes. She was not powerful. She was not famous. She did not stand on stages or give speeches or lead crowds. She was simply a woman living her life, believing that love, patience, and hard work were enough to carry a person through difficult times. And for a while, they were. Mariya woke each day knowing someone was waiting for her at the end of it. A husband serving far away, somewhere beyond her reach, somewhere inside the chaos of war. She waited for letters, not knowing when they would arrive. Sometimes days passed, sometimes weeks. But when they came, they were proof that life still existed beyond the noise of the world. Then, one day, the letter arrived. It did not look different from the others. The paper was thin, the envelope plain. Nothing about it warned her of what it carried. She opened it slowly, expecting familiar words, routine words, reassuring words. Instead, she found finality. Her husband was dead. No story, no explanation, no details she could hold on to, just a sentence that erased the future she had imagined. In that moment, Mariya did not collapse. She did not scream. She did not beg the world to undo what had already been done. She sat in silence. And inside that silence, something changed. Grief did not leave her weak. It made her still. And in that stillness, a decision began to form. While others around her mourned in private rooms, while families clung to photographs and memories, while the war continued to take names without faces, Mariya chose a path no one expected. She did not ask to be protected. She did not ask for sympathy. She did not ask to be remembered. She sold what she owned, not in anger, not in haste, but with quiet determination. Her belongings, her comforts, the small pieces of life she once thought she would grow old with. And when the last item was gone, she gathered the money, sat down, and wrote a letter. Not to a friend, not to family, but to the government. Those who read it expected grief. They expected desperation. They expected a request. What they received was something else entirely. Mariya offered to buy a weapon of war. Not to escape the pain, not to watch from a distance. She offered to buy a tank. And then, at the bottom of the letter, she added the sentence that changed everything. She wanted to drive it herself. Imagine the silence that followed, the disbelief, the hesitation. A woman, a widow, not asking for safety, but asking for the front line. History rarely pauses for moments like this, moments when loss does not end a life, but redirects it. Mariya Oktyabrskaya did not look like a soldier. She did not sound like one. She did not fit the image war was used to seeing, yet war was about to meet her. What kind of person trades grief for resolve? What kind of heart chooses danger over distance? What kind of love demands action instead of mourning? This is not a story about tactics or strategies. It is not about uniforms or ranks. It is about a woman who refused to let tragedy decide who she would become. A woman who believed that love, once taken, required an answer. And the answer she chose was not silence. It was motion, steel, and a road that led straight into history. And this was only the beginning. Before history learned her name, before steel tracks cut across frozen ground, before war placed her where no woman expected to stand, Mariya Oktyabrskaya lived a life that felt small, ordinary, and invisible to the world. She was not raised to be remembered. She was raised to endure. Born into a time where survival itself was an achievement, Mariya learned early that life did not promise comfort. It promised responsibility. Her days were shaped by routine, work completed quietly, meals prepared without ceremony, evenings spent in modest rooms warmed more by familiarity than luxury. She belonged to a generation that did not speak often of dreams. They spoke instead of duty. When Mariya married, love did not arrive loudly. It arrived steadily. Her husband, a man shaped by the same world, carried himself with quiet seriousness. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic gestures, just partnership. They shared simple plans, a future that looked ordinary but felt secure, and for a time, that was enough. Then the world shifted. The distant rumble of war, once spoken of in guarded conversations, became unavoidable. Borders moved on maps, names of places changed meaning, and young men were pulled from homes with little warning. Her husband left not as a hero, but as someone doing what was expected. Mariya did not cry when he departed. She stood still, hands folded, watching until he disappeared from sight. She told herself that patience was strength, that waiting was part of loving someone in a dangerous time. Days became weeks. Weeks stretched into months. Letters arrived irregularly, sometimes filled with reassurance, sometimes brief and cautious. She learned to read between the lines. She learned how silence could mean safety and how too many words could mean danger. Each letter was read slowly, then folded carefully, and placed where it could be returned to again and again. These were not just messages. They were proof that life still existed beyond uncertainty. Mariya built her days around waiting. Waiting for footsteps outside, waiting for the sound of paper being pushed through a door, waiting for a future that still felt possible. But war has a way of changing the meaning of waiting. One morning, the routine was broken. The knock was different, heavier, more formal. The envelope she received did not carry warmth. It carried authority. The words inside were brief, measured, final. Her husband had fallen in combat. No story followed, no explanation offered, no detail to soften the truth. Only absence. In that moment, Mariya did not collapse. She did not scream. She did not ask why. She sat. Still. The room around her felt unchanged, yet everything inside her had shifted. Grief did not arrive as chaos. It arrived as clarity. She understood, with a certainty that surprised even her, that the life she had been waiting for was gone. But something else remained. Responsibility. Not to memory alone, but to meaning. In the days that followed, people came and went. Words were spoken, hands were held, yet Mariya felt strangely separate from it all. She moved through her days with precision, meals prepared, rooms cleaned. Outwardly, nothing appeared broken, but inwardly, she was measuring something. Not sorrow, not anger, purpose. She began to look at her belongings differently. Each item told a story. Each carried a piece of the life she no longer had, and slowly, deliberately, she began to let them go. Not in desperation, not in protest, but with intent. Clothes were sold, household items exchanged. What remained was reduced to what was necessary and what could be turned into something else. Money gathered quietly. No one around her fully understood what she was doing. They assumed grief had taken its own form. But Mariya was not preparing to retreat from life. She was preparing to confront it. One evening, as light faded from the room, she sat at a small desk. In front of her lay paper, a pen, and a decision that had been forming for weeks. She did not write as a widow seeking relief. She wrote as a citizen answering a call. Her words were measured, respectful, direct. She explained who she was, what she had lost, and then she made an offer. She would contribute everything she had saved, every possession turned into currency, to the war effort. But she did not stop there. At the end of the letter, she added a request that transformed it from contribution into declaration. She did not want her sacrifice to be distant. She wanted to serve directly. She wanted to fight, not as a symbol, not as an exception, but as someone willing to stand where her husband could not return. She sealed the letter without hesitation, and in doing so,
crossed an invisible line. What she could not yet know was this: the moment that letter was read, her life would no longer belong to quiet rooms and careful routines. It would belong to noise, to movement, to decisions made under fire. Mariya Oktyabrskaya did not yet wear a uniform. She had not touched a weapon. She had not heard the roar of engines or felt the ground shake beneath her feet. But the path had already been chosen, not by fate, but by resolve. And once set in motion, there would be no turning back.
The training grounds had prepared Mariya Oktyabrskaya for many things, but nothing could truly prepare a person for the moment when war became real. Orders finally arrived. The long weeks of practice were over. Now, the machines that had once moved across dusty training fields would roll toward a battlefield where mistakes carried consequences no training exercise could simulate. Early one morning, before the sun had fully risen, Mariya stood beside the tank she would soon command in combat. The metal surface of the vehicle was cold beneath her hand. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to simply stand there, not as a soldier preparing for war, but as a woman remembering why she had come this far. Her husband's memory was never far from her thoughts. It was the reason she had written the letter, the reason she had sold everything she owned, and the reason she now stood beside a machine built for destruction. The tank crew gathered nearby. Men who had once doubted her now treated her as one of their own. They had watched her endure the same harsh training. They had seen her push herself harder than anyone expected. And now they would fight together. The journey to the front line took hours. Convoys of armored vehicles moved slowly along rough roads scarred by months of war. Villages passed by in silence. Many buildings stood damaged or abandoned. Fields that once produced crops now carried the marks of artillery. War had changed everything. As the tanks moved closer to the combat zone, the atmosphere shifted. The distant rumble of artillery became louder. Smoke could be seen rising far ahead. The battlefield was no longer an abstract idea. It was a place waiting just beyond the horizon. When the convoy finally stopped, soldiers climbed down to receive their instructions. Maps were spread across the hood of a vehicle. Commanders explained the situation carefully. Enemy forces held positions ahead. Soviet units would push forward to break through their defenses. Tanks like Mariya's would lead the advance. Inside her tank, the air felt heavy with anticipation. The cramped interior smelled of oil, metal, and fuel. Every member of the crew checked their equipment silently. No one spoke much because everyone understood what was about to happen. When the engine started, the tank trembled beneath them. The powerful machine slowly rolled forward. Soon, the quiet preparation was replaced by the thunder of battle. Gunfire cracked across the landscape. Explosions echoed in the distance. The ground itself seemed to shake beneath the movement of armored vehicles. Through narrow viewing slits, Mariya guided the tank carefully. Her hands moved steadily across the controls. Training had taught her the mechanics, but now instinct and determination carried her forward. Shells burst against the earth nearby. Smoke and dust filled the air, yet the advance continued. The battlefield was chaotic. Burned vehicles marked earlier clashes. Broken trees and shattered ground created dangerous obstacles for heavy tanks. But Mariya maneuvered carefully, keeping the vehicle moving forward. Inside the tank, communication was constant. Short commands, quick decisions. Each member of the crew relied on the others. Then, suddenly, the enemy resistance intensified. Gunfire struck the armored hull with sharp metallic sounds. For a brief moment, the noise inside the tank became overwhelming. Yet Mariya did not hesitate. She adjusted the tank's direction, navigating through damaged terrain, keeping the machine moving despite the chaos outside. What mattered most was momentum. A tank that stopped for too long became an easy target, and Mariya understood that instinctively. The heavy machine pushed forward through smoke and debris. Each meter gained felt like a victory. And gradually, the enemy resistance began to weaken. The battle did not last forever. Eventually, the advance succeeded.
Enemy positions were forced to retreat, and the tanks rolled past the ground where fighting had been fiercest. When the engines finally slowed, the battlefield grew strangely quiet. Smoke drifted slowly across the damaged land. Soldiers climbed from their vehicles, exhausted but alive. For Mariya, this moment carried a quiet realization. She had done it. The widow who once sat alone reading a letter had now driven a tank through a real battlefield, and she had not faltered. Her fellow soldiers looked at her differently now, not with curiosity, not with doubt, but with genuine respect, because they had witnessed something important. Mariya Oktyabrskaya was not simply participating in the war, she belonged there. But the war was far from finished. The battle they had just survived was only one moment in a much larger conflict. More operations would come, more dangerous missions, and soon Mariya would face a moment that would test her courage more than anything she had experienced so far. A moment when her tank would be struck, and when the decision she made in that instant would become the story soldiers would repeat for years.
By the time winter tightened its grip on the battlefield, Mariya Oktyabrskaya was no longer a curiosity among soldiers. She had become something else entirely, a presence. Men who once questioned whether she belonged inside a tank now spoke about her with quiet respect, because they had seen what happened when her machine rolled forward. They had seen the determination that refused to slow down. The tank she operated had already earned a name among the crew, not an official name, not something written on documents, but a name spoken quietly among soldiers, because everyone understood that this tank was different. It carried a driver who treated every meter of battlefield like unfinished business. Mariya did not move recklessly, she moved with intention. Each maneuver calculated, each advance measured. War had already taken the person she loved most. Now, the battlefield had become the place where that loss transformed into action. During one bitterly cold morning, the order arrived for another advance. The ground was frozen solid, the air thick with smoke drifting across broken terrain. Engines roared to life one by one. Heavy armored vehicles began moving forward, their tracks grinding against the frozen earth. Inside her tank, Mariya adjusted the controls carefully. Her movements were calm, almost routine. But the soldiers who had fought beside her knew something important. When Mariya Oktyabrskaya moved toward danger, she did not turn back. The advance began slowly. Enemy resistance appeared quickly. Gunfire cracked across the open field. Shells exploded in distant bursts of dirt and smoke. The battlefield became a storm of sound. Yet inside the tank, focus replaced fear. Mariya guided the heavy machine forward, navigating obstacles left behind by previous battles. Burned vehicles, broken ground, fragments of abandoned equipment. Each movement required strength and concentration. Then, suddenly, the tank jolted violently. The impact echoed through the metal hull. Something had struck the tracks. For a moment, the entire vehicle shuddered. The crew inside immediately understood the danger. A damaged track could leave them stranded, and a stranded tank in open combat rarely survived long. Voices inside the vehicle shouted instructions. The safest decision would have been clear. Retreat, pull back behind cover, repair the damage away from enemy fire. But Mariya had never chosen the safest path. Instead, she stopped the tank, opened the hatch, and climbed out. The battlefield outside was chaos. Gunfire cracked across the frozen ground. Bullets struck nearby metal with sharp metallic echoes. Most soldiers would have remained inside armored protection, but Mariya moved directly toward the damaged track, tools in hand. Kneeling beside the massive steel links, she began repairing the damage herself. The cold ground beneath her knees, the noise of battle surrounding her. None of it slowed her movements. Her hands worked quickly, tightening metal connections, forcing broken pieces back into alignment. Inside the tank, the crew watched in disbelief. They understood exactly how exposed she was.
Yet Mariya worked as though time itself had narrowed to one task: fix the track, keep moving, return to the fight. Minutes passed that felt far longer. Finally, the repair held. Without hesitation, she climbed back inside the tank, the engine roared again, and the heavy machine lurched forward once more. Soldiers nearby witnessed the moment with amazement because they understood what they had just seen. Not recklessness, not desperation, but a level of determination rarely found even among hardened veterans. Word of the incident spread quickly through the unit. Stories traveled faster than official reports. Some exaggerated the details, others repeated the event exactly as it happened, but every version ended with the same conclusion. Mariya Oktyabrskaya was unlike anyone they had fought beside before. Her tank became a symbol among the troops, a reminder that courage did not always arrive in expected forms. And yet, the war was far from finished. Each new battle carried risks greater than the last. The front lines shifted constantly. Commanders planned larger offensives, and tanks like Mariya's would soon be sent into even more dangerous situations. Because the war demanded relentless movement, forward, always forward. But what no one could know yet was that the moment which secured Mariya's place in history was still waiting ahead, and when it came, it would test every ounce of strength she had left.
The repaired tank moved forward again, its heavy tracks grinding across the frozen battlefield. Inside the metal hull, Mariya Oktyabrskaya remained calm. For many soldiers, surviving a battle like the one she had just faced would have been enough. They would have remembered the danger. They would have slowed down. But Mariya had never come to war simply to survive. She had come because the war had taken something from her, something that could never be returned. And in her mind, the battlefield had become the only place where that loss could be answered. As winter slowly began to fade, the fighting intensified across the Eastern Front. Entire regions became battlegrounds. Tanks rolled across forests, fields, and villages that had already been scarred by months of conflict, and Mariya's machine was sent wherever the fighting grew most difficult. Her crew had now thought beside her long enough to understand something important. She was not reckless. She was focused. Every movement she made inside the tank had purpose. Every decision carried the quiet determination of someone who had already accepted the risks. During one particularly fierce operation, Soviet forces were ordered to advance toward heavily defended enemy positions. The terrain was dangerous. Open ground offered little protection. Enemy artillery waited beyond the tree line. Still, the tanks moved forward. The roar of engines echoed across the battlefield as armored vehicles pressed ahead through smoke and shattered earth. Inside her tank, Mariya guided the machine carefully. The battlefield outside flashed with explosions. Shells burst against the ground. Fragments of metal tore through the air. Yet the advance continued. Then, without warning, a powerful explosion erupted nearby. The shock wave struck Mariya's tank with brutal force. Inside the cramped metal interior, the impact felt like a thunderclap. For a moment, the world seemed to spin. Dust and smoke filled the air inside the tank. The crew struggled to regain control, but Mariya had been struck. The explosion had caused severe injury. Despite the chaos around them, her fellow crew members acted quickly. The tank pulled back from the front line. Medics were called. And soon, Mariya Oktyabrskaya was being rushed away from the battlefield she had fought so hard to reach. The hospital where she was taken was far from the thunder of artillery, but the damage she had suffered was serious. Days passed as doctors did everything they could. Soldiers who had fought beside her sent messages asking about her condition. Stories of her courage had already begun spreading far beyond her unit. Across military camps and command posts, people spoke about the woman who had bought a tank with her own savings.
The woman who had driven it into battle, the woman who had stepped outside the safety of armor to repair it while bullets flew around her. For many, her story sounded almost unbelievable, yet every detail was true. Mariya remained under medical care for weeks. Sometimes she was conscious, sometimes she drifted between awareness and exhaustion. But those who visited her later said that one thing never changed: her calmness. She did not speak of regret. She did not question her choices, because she had already done what she believed was right. In March of 1944, the long struggle finally came to an end. Mariya Oktyabrskaya passed away from the injuries she had suffered during battle. She was only 43 years old, but by then, her story had already traveled far beyond the battlefield. The Soviet Union honored her bravery with one of its highest awards. She was named Hero of the Soviet Union, a recognition reserved for extraordinary courage. Yet medals and titles told part of the story, because what truly made Mariya unforgettable was not simply that she fought, it was why she fought. She had not been trained for war since childhood. She had not expected to become a soldier. She had simply refused to let loss define the rest of her life. Instead, she transformed grief into determination, and determination into action. The tank she once drove was given a name that soldiers would remember for years: the Fighting Girlfriend. A strange name for a weapon of war, but one that captured the spirit of the woman behind the controls. Today, decades after the war ended, Mariya Oktyabrskaya's story continues to be told, not because she was the strongest soldier, not because she commanded armies, but because she proved something powerful: that courage can appear in the most unexpected places, that even in the darkest moments of history, an ordinary person can choose to do something extraordinary, and sometimes that choice becomes a legacy that refuses to fade.